Knight and Changeling, Chapter 5, Tracking. It took 2 more weeks to track down the exact ingredients they needed, but 2 months into Jen's exile in the past found her and Sir George standing alone in an old ruined castle several miles away from the court. They'd both agreed that enchanting the book was a delicate process, and they needed to not be interrupted. So they set up in the courtyard of this abandoned castle. Jen had prepped most of what they needed before they left the castle. She took a deep breath. Okay, so I need to link the book to the blood. Hang on. She spun the ultimatrix and turned into stardust. She pulled the spell book out of thin air and flipped it to the proper page. Okay, she handed the book to George. Hold that open while I do this. He nodded and held open the book. Mixing the ingredients didn't take too long, but the actual process of the spell took a bit longer. But eventually, Jen chanted out of the book, pouring the mixture of ingredients into the green journal. George didn't understand the words that slipped from between greenish-black lips, but the spectacle was something to see. The powder she had mixed with the bloody handkerchief and seawater, and sank into the pages of the book, completely, kerchief and all, turning them black as ink for a moment. Then they glowed green so brightly it was like a beacon. He had to close his eyes to block out the light. The book snapped shut, and the light died. A smaller flash of green spiraled around Jen as she picked up the book. He blinked.
Did it work?
She held out the book to him. Try it. He frowned at her. The handkerchief the blood was on was yours. It's connected to you. You have to be the one to use it. He raised an eyebrow.
You cannot use it.
Jen sighed. It's kind of a long story, but if I could use it, there would have been problems later. He frowned again, but nodded slightly. She was always speaking like this, as if terms of time were slightly confusing. He made to open the book and frowned. A leather clasp that hadn't been there before now closed it, sealed tightly. Just put your finger there. He did so, and the lock flashed, and the book fell open. For a moment, he wasn't sure it had worked, but the book lit up, and a map spread across it like drops of water on the page. The normal lines of the map were shimmering black, like that of the pearls she'd used in the mixture. One spot on the map, though, was red as blood. Jen cried out in triumph as George smiled. We can find the creature. We can end this. When they returned with this news, the king ordered a feast to celebrate. The knights would leave to hunt the creature 2 days hence. The party lasted well into the night. Minstrels played their lutes, and George insisted that Jen join him in a dance. She laughed, truly laughed, for the first time since they'd met. It was a beautiful night. The following months, however, were grueling, to say the least. Tracking the Dagon, even with the book, was complicated because it moved seemingly without warning or pattern. They would come within 100 miles of the place and it would vanish. But they persisted. Every now and again they would run across a nest of Lacubra, and George got to use Ascalon. Jen was impressed at the power of the sword, which were more akin to magic than technology she usually saw from Asmith's creation. But she was losing heart a bit. Jen was keeping track of the days in a similar notebook George had purchased for her on their last day in the city. He had also gifted her with a dagger, the crossguard adorned with a single gleaming emerald, the handle wrapped in soft leather. She wore it on a sheath on her calf, hidden beneath her skirts. She'd taken the liberty to reinforce the dagger the first chance she got. She turned into Diamond Head and carefully coated the blade with a thin layer of tadenite. It was smooth and sharp, a glittering jeweled blade that she could wield with deadly precision. She sighed down at her notebook as she flicked the piece of charcoal across the page, adding another tally mark. She couldn't help but count them. 5 months and 29 days. She wondered if her family had given up finding her by now. She'd never been off on her own like this for this long before. At most, it had been a few days at a time. She sighed, flicking closed the book. Any sign? She asked George, who was poring over the book.
Shouldn't you be at your sword practice?
He asked, with little heat behind his words as she sat on the desk beside him. He'd given up teaching her manners nearly 3 months ago. She was just too much of a free spirit for it to stick, and far too stubborn. I knocked Sir Reginald out again. George snorted. Several of the knights had been incensed when he'd insisted on training her in the way of the sword. A woman's place was in the home, after all. But she was a quick study, and had already beaten most of them in combat after challenging them when they called her unfit. She hadn't even had to transform. He glanced at her and nodded. Good. She rolled her eyes at him as he spotted something out of the corner of his eye. She had her sword at her side. She'd earned it only 2 months ago, graduating from the dull-edged training swords to a real one quite quickly. The situation made it necessary. He'd have liked her to spend a year or more with the practiced blade before she went on to the edged blade, but she was proving quite skilled. And they were catching up to the Dagon. They had been set upon a few times by Lacubra, a sign that their efforts weren't going unnoticed. He glanced back down at the book and smiled. We need to move now. He snatched up the book, and she got a look at where the elusive red marker now sat, directly above where the court was currently residing. Jen raced out of the tent after George. Chapter 6. Final Battle. When they arrived, the fight was already in full swing. Jen leapt from her horse, transforming into jet ray as she went, speeding into the air, blasting Lacubra left, right, and center. They hissed and sizzled, collapsing under her attacks as George shouted a challenge to the Dagon. The great black beast with cruel, burning red eyes howled in frustration, reaching out to bat Jen out of the sky. The other knights weren't as effective against the Lacubra, as they couldn't stay out of their reach as easily as she did. She dodged, but only just. A whirlwind from Ascalon cleaving between them. Your fight is with me, creature! George snarled as Jen landed, switching transformations to Diamond Head and firing off a volley of Tadenite shards. The creatures howled as they fell. The fight between George and the Dagon was hard to follow. Jen was more concerned with making it out of the fight alive, and saving as many of the knights as she could. At some point, she ended up on the fringe of the battle, and turned to find the true struggle happening there. George was tearing Ascalon through the Dagon's chest. The beast howled so loud all activity around it stopped. Jen didn't think. Didn't notice that her skirt was torn and tattered. Didn't realize that at some point she'd lost the veil that covered her now nearly chin-length hair. She rushed to help as George pulled Ascalon free from the creature. It screamed, for the length of the sword was embedded in its heart, which was pulled free from the body of the creature, which began to writhe and smoke. Jen spun the dial on the Ultimatrix and slapped it down, leaping between George and the smoke as it made to strike out at him. Stardust's mana saved both of them. Jen knew what she had to do. In a way, she'd always known. The seal on the Lacubra had been magical, something the Forever Knights couldn't do. She chanted loudly as George pulled back the heart of the creature, draining of color the farther he got from it. Stone formed from the smoky form of the Dagon as it kept screaming. A much smaller green stone formed in Jen's hand as the seal thumped to the ground. With a few words and a gesture, the seal vanished entirely. She sunk to the ground, exhausted. The green rock in her hand, a mirror image of the seal, slipped from her fingers. She felt exhausted, but it was more than that. Something was wrong. George pulled her to her feet, Ascalon still at his side, the heart of the Dagon still impaled upon it. That needs to be hidden, she said, pointing. He nodded. But where? Jen glanced around and spotted the black fortress. They had often seen it in the distance when they got close to the Dagon. It shimmered in the air like an illusion. Jen pointed a greenish-black finger at the impaled heart and chanted, pointing at the fortress. The sword vanished in a swirl of green light. The fortress dissolved from sight. If you need it, you have the book. She stumbled slightly, and George caught her as she transformed back to normal. Pink light began to swirl around her. She looked down, hope blossoming in her face. It was keeping me here. She grinned, then her face turned serious, checking that her sword was still in place. When this happens again, find me. Before George could ask what she meant, the pink lights engulfed her, and she was gone. Winning the battle felt like a double-edged sword. The creature was gone, but so was the new daughter he'd found in the strange girl, Jennifer Tennyson. He picked up the stone she'd dropped. It was a mirror copy of the seal she'd used on the Dagon. He found her horse after the fight, grazing on some grass, her saddlebag still in place. All she'd had with her when she vanished was her belt, holding the items she'd carried when she first appeared, and her sword, a hooded cloak around her shoulders to ward off the chill of winter that was settling in. Her small book was sticking out of one of the bags. He pulled it out. There were 6 months' worth of tally marks here, counting the time she'd spent with them. But as he flicked through the pages, he frowned. George, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. Hopefully we won and I've gone home. But either way, there are a few things you need to know. I need to come clean. I once told you Azimuth didn't send me. That is true. I fought a Lacubra 1,700 years into the future. It took control of my cousin, who is gifted with magical abilities. She tossed me back in time. But I had heard of you before I ever saw the Lacubra. He stared at the page. She had written about his journal and the book they'd used to track the Dagon. In my bag, you will find a shield generator, a small silver device that I know you've seen me playing with. It's programmed so that only I'll be able to open it in the future. All you have to do is put it in the castle library with your journal and the book to track the Dagon inside it. Then press the button on top and step back. It will stay there until I find it. But if I'm right, then the Dagon is coming back in my time. I will need your help. Find me in the future. He turned as one of the surviving knights approached him.
What shall we do, Sir George? The king is dead, slain by one of the knights under the control of the Lacubra.
George's hand tightened on the stone in his hand.
We must ensure this never happens again. We, the survivors of this battle, and our children for generations will guard the secrets of this battle, and defend the world from those that would harm it.
The knight bowed to him.